Hi. So it's Friday. It's the end of 7 months of a lot of work on this exhibition and a really exciting week. But I wanted today just to be really fun and sort of lift off and just talk about art and film and costume and fashion like a kaleidoscope of intersecting ideas and why it really belongs in a museum, and just sort of selfishly talk about things that I'm interested in. And when I arrived here in April, I think one of the very first people that I met was Susan Felleman, and she said, I write about art and movies. And looking into it further, she has this whole unique perspective. I'm super excited. There's no one else I would want to have this conversation with, so I'm going to let you introduce your work a little bit.
Oh, thank you very much. I am one of not very many people that whose sort of real specialization deals with the intersection of film and the fine arts. Lots of people have dealt with it, but it's sort of the center of my research. And here are covers of 3 books that I've published. The first one was a revision of my dissertation, and it was about the films of a fairly unknown by his name Hollywood writer, producer, director named Albert Lewin. He only directed 6 films. He was actually a big producer at MGM in the 1930s. He took home the Academy Awards for The Good Earth and Beyond the Bounty, but he turned into a writer-director at a kind of belated age. And he just made a handful of really strange, arty films that caught my attention. I was always interested in both art and cinema, so I wrote an art history dissertation about him and his films. If you're familiar with any of his films, it's probably The Picture of Dorian Gray, the 1945 MGM version that has this Ivan Albright painting in Technicolor appear. So just that phenomenon of a modernist painting appearing in color in a black and white film got my attention when I was in grad school, and it took me on this long journey, which I'm still on. The second book, the one in the middle, is a kind of theoretical view of the way art, different ways that art is used in motion pictures, mostly, narrative, commercial narrative type motion pictures, but ranging from kind of the European art film to, Hollywood films. And the most recent one on the right is more specifically about a specific problem of art and cinema, real objects in, so it's called Real Objects in Unreal Situations, and it's specifically about modern art objects that are authentic as opposed to copies or pastiches or props appearing in fiction films. And so it's a sort of series of case studies, and one of those will sort of crop up and sneak into the talking that we're doing today. I'm sort of qualified to be here talking about this, not because I know that much about costumes, but because I think about problems having to do with material culture as it connects with film, and also with the way that art history is a really important source. I'm going to be talking about that when we have our conversation. So that's a little bit about me. The book that's going to be coming out next is about sculpture in cinema. It's co-authored with a few other people, and that'll be out sometime this coming year.
Love it. So I'm glad that you said material culture, because that's my interest as well. And also just to kind of introduce, for some of you, I think I probably just dropped into town with you don't know what I've been doing all these years. And so this is kind of a collection of some of my favorite things that I've been doing. When I was out in Seattle writing about, I switched from Renaissance art to modern art, sort of blindly and naively. And I wrote about the Ballet Russe at a time when the Ballet Russe hadn't quite become very popular yet. And my art history supervisor, I'm losing the word. Anyway, she didn't think it was art history, and I fought for it, and I love this topic of the intersection of choreography, of artists making costumes and sets for the theater, and how it interweaves with choreography and all the other arts. So that's where I really fell in love with these interdisciplinary topics, and that took me to Texas, where I worked with a collection of theater collection within a museum, and working on Russians who worked emigre artists in the 40s. And I fell in love with Russian constructivism. So you can see, I wish I had a pointer. After the Russian Revolution, this is really sort of my specialty, the only way, I imagine a world without television, right? So you had to send plays around. And so costumes were part of these plays, and then the birth of film. I think most of you probably know that Soviet cinema is really one of the leading avant-garde cinemas, and they did a lot with, montage. And so this intersection of performance and cinema and costumes and these textile artists making costumes. So anyway, I have a book on this coming out next year that's just in design phase, so I don't even have a cover to show you yet, but that's exciting. And then when I was in Pittsburgh, just before this, I worked on an exhibition of industrial design. That's the cover of the catalog, and then that's an installation shot, which I just think is candy beautiful. But this idea of design, and I really, and that's kind of a segue, I'm really interested in really bringing attention to design at the Columbia Museum of Art, and costume as part of design is a really exciting facet of that. So I'm going to be talking about a lot of modernist things today just because I'm being selfish about that, and I'm really excited about it. So I'm going to start, okay, this is Aelita, Queen of Mars. The first exhibition I ever curated back in 2004 was of stage, not the costumes. There was one puppet, but it was the drawings and the preliminary costume designs and set designs by Alexandra Exter, who is a Russian artist from the 20s, of her work with both ballet and film. And what's so interesting about this, look at the materials of these costumes. Does anyone know about Russian constructivism? Very few people do. But basically, artists were told to kill painting and go into the factory. So to sum that up in a really brief way, their new materials became steel, concrete, early plastic, celluloid. So look at these costumes. She's translating this new movement into these costumes, and the entire movie doesn't look like this. This is just the series that takes place on Mars. So it goes between everyday Russia and then Mars, but it's part of this movement, which Susan knows well, where avant-garde art movements are used in these peculiar ways in films. Think of Spellbound by Hitchcock with Dali's dream sequence, where it's supposed to be a psychoanalytic dream. Well, here, this movement is used for outer space. It was the future. This is what they wanted their future to look like. And film operated in such a useful way, and that they had no materials to make that future with, but you could still broadcast what the future would look like. And they still never got there, but it was an interesting way to, they call it news from a radiant future.
Wow. News from a radiant future.
Yeah. So that's Exter. And these are some of her costume designs. And look at how the costume moves and actually bends. It kind of looks like some of the corsets that we've seen in the exhibition too. Some of those actually, accordion-like, would bend. But how do you translate something that looks like an abstract painting into costume is a really interesting question. And this is the movement more broadly that these are based on. These are these really early, they're sculptures, but they were supposed to be convincing people that they could also build bridges. And then this is a really famous monument that was supposed to be a living monument, and question what a monument was. It's Totland's Tower. And the bottom floor was supposed to rotate once a month, and the second floor once a week, and the upper floor once a day. And so it was actually living, and it would project onto the clouds, news, and motorcycles would zoom out of the back and distribute pamphlets. So it was this active living monument, but you can see this translated into costume design. And then this other, are you familiar with the work of Sonia Delaunay? Has anyone gone to see the Guggenheim show that's at the Gibbs in Charleston right now? Because you'd see a painting by her husband, Robert. But she lifted off into all these other directions, not least in order to support them at certain times in their life, where she moved into textile design, rugs, interior design, all these different directions. So while he became the more famous of the married couple for years and years and years, she's being reevaluated as a slightly more interested and more versatile artist. So she started making these textiles when she made a baby blanket, a crib blanket for her son in 1911. And that's the blanket on the left that kind of started this whole new direction for her. And it's based on this Russian peasant patchwork. just how they would just piece things together. And
there was a show devoted to her at the Cooper Hewitt a few years ago.
yes, you saw that.
Yeah, it was a remarkable exhibition. I think it originated in Paris, but it was up with 4 or 5 years ago in New York, in case you bumped into it at the Cooper Hewitt.
And what was your favorite part? What stood out about that?
Oh, it was exceptional. I mean, it had a lot. It was mainly about her textile design and her clothing.
So this is an example of her painting behind you. So her idea was that by putting contrasting colors next to each other, you're creating all of this living movement. So movement for her was very, very important. So it was abstract art, but with a real kinetic purpose. And so she and her husband happened to be vacationing in Spain at the time that World War I broke out. And Diaghilev's Ballet Russe, my former love, happened to be in Spain at the time. And so they commissioned them to make sets. Robert made the set design and she did the costume. So this is her costume for Cleopatra, which is just beautiful. And this idea that she would go from a baby blanket to, okay, these things need to move, because they're already moving, they're already flickering. So then how do you put that flickering abstraction into even more movement? And she really felt that they needed to. So the idea of a ballet is just exciting. These are some of her, again, how do you translate? I think when we think of the costume designs for costumes in cut, we think that they must have looked so realistic, and then you translate that into fabric. But how do you translate this painting into a coat? And this coat on the right was actually owned by Gloria Swanson, the old silent movie actress you might know from Sunset Boulevard. But so the customers for Delaunay were these really creative elites, and she had her own shop called Sonia by 1921 in Paris. You can see her influence still going on today with some recreations. She's being rediscovered over and over again. And these are just beautiful. I'm showing you these just because if you haven't seen them before, your day just got better, because they're just beautiful. These are her swimsuits.
Who is in political power at the time? Is it not just around 1924? What was the political atmosphere at that time?
Oh, well, so I should have said this. She was born in Ukraine, and she went with a wealthier relative. She was born into a Jewish family in Ukraine. She went to live with her relatives in St. Petersburg. So she really grew up as a child going to museums. She was very artistically trained, and then she went to Paris, and she married an openly gay gallerist out of convenience. She could stay in Paris and didn't have to go back home. And then she met Robert Delaunay, and they fell in love. And so I think in 1910 they got married. So Russia, the revolution is going to happen in 1917. So they missed all that. So did the Ballet Russe. They all were gone before that happened.
But not Alexander Exter.
No.
She was working under the Soviets, and constructivism was a Soviet
So that was
movement.
actually happening during the revolution.
Yes, the constructivism was a Soviet revolutionary movement, and for the first few years of the Soviet Union, even for a couple of years after the death of Lenin, there was a lot of optimism and utopianism about art, and then as Stalin's power entrenched, there was kind of a crackdown and a backlash. But there were some very utopian years there for a while.
Interesting.
Exter was an interesting constructivist in that she had already been working for the theater before that, and she worked in fashion design under the Soviets. And so she moved to Paris permanently in 1924, but she didn't ever suffer any backlash. She was still there during the hotbed when, it would be like when the artists who couldn't sell their paintings here today, suddenly there was a revolution and they went to work for the government and were put in charge, and they got to hire all their friends. So this is, most people think that the 1925 Paris Exposition was way more modern than it actually was. There were only a couple of what we would consider modern displays there. The rest was, relatively safe. So here's some Cubist trees that really are distinctive modern moment. And then Delaunay is posing her costume or her everyday clothing designs. So she's lifting off. She's gone from a crib blanket to painting to everyday wear. And this is a film featuring her clothing. And really, I just want to get at the point that for her, she felt like the movement was so important. So this idea of everyday life, ballet, and film, for me, there's no division. At this time, modernists, they didn't see a division between these applied arts. It was actually very exciting. Some of them actually introduced some of their most avant-garde works through pillows, for example. I mean, that literally happened. So, I also don't see a division or a hierarchy between these arts. She is about to do something awesome. Look at that.
So it's activewear. I mean, it's
Yeah.
practically the first sort of really conceptually conceived as activewear, because think about what she's doing.
Right.
She's one of the first people to design ballet costumes. The ballet russe costumes, as well as like swimwear and this kind of clothing that's meant to be seen in action.
And
very different than the kinds of
right,
a lot of the kinds of
right.
clothing that you see.
Coco Chanel too would also design costumes for the ballet russe and for films. Okay, she's all caught
Around
up.
the same period.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's probably done. It's just delightful. I just want to make your Friday better. So she ended up, there's this very avant-garde department store in Amsterdam. They were really into integration of the arts. And so she worked for them through the 30s for textile designs. And I actually think that the exhibition you saw at Cooper Hewitt came about because some of the relatives found her old design book above a washing machine in their descendants.
There was a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
On the textile, just a whole wall of different textile designs.
So it's taken me forever. I have never seen these films. One of them apparently is almost impossible to see. I'm sure if I spent a month I could find them. But just to show her work for film and what that would have looked like, it's very interesting because while there's still light and dark contrast, they're black and white films. So her color wouldn't be coming through. But again, what does it mean to use an avant-garde artist in your film? What was being, what function was that serving in the story? Because you're definitely aware of it. It still wasn't mainstream. You're aware that you're seeing something particular. Okay, I have talked too long. Susan?
So a complete sort of change of pace here. We're going from very exciting avant-garde and at its time really contemporary fashion/costume. And I think that the material that Catherine just presented blurs the boundaries between fashion and costume. When an avant-garde thing appears in a sort of more mainstream film, it seems like costume, but it's the kind of thing that the avant-garde were wearing.
And it says something about the character. If the character was modern enough to wear that, then that really says something about the character and makes them stand out from everyone else.
So this is one really interesting intersection between art, film, and costume, which is when an artist, Sonia Delaunay was a visual artist before she was a designer, a fashion or a costume designer. So that is literally fashion/costume as art in cinema and in life. Thinking about the period film, and especially about the kind of costumes you're seeing in this exhibition, I'm really intrigued by the fact that the relationship between art history and the period film. When you think about it, prior to the age of photography, what we know about the way the world looked is a function of what survives from history and what was represented in art. And costumes are a particularly interesting problem because they don't survive in the same sort of solid, prolific way that, say, furniture does. When you go to museums, you see porcelain, you see furniture, you see a lot of material culture from the past. You don't see a lot of textile, and you don't see a lot of clothing. When you find textile, it's often fragments, because it just doesn't, it's worn, and it's also more fragile, so it just doesn't survive the way other artifacts do. So a lot of what we think we know about the way people dressed and looked in history comes from paintings. And so that's what this little section is about. I just created a couple of case studies here. This is an introduction to it in a way. Focused first on the Elizabethan period, which is a favorite period for representing in film for a number of reasons. probably because of the importance of Shakespeare as the a major cultural figure of that period. So many of his plays are imagined as being set in the Elizabethan moment, but there are many other reasons and all periods of Western history are represented in film ultimately. That's true in non-Western countries as well, that there are period films that are set in the remote past and the near past. But I'm just going to focus on the Elizabethan period for a moment. So here's a famous instance of the way that art history is a source for the costume design of film. I believe that most of the costumes that Kate Blanchett wears as Elizabeth in the film Elizabeth are based on the many, many portraits of the Queen that are preserved from history. So here's one, the coronation portrait, clearly being carefully copied. This is one of my favorite films and one that people are not so familiar with. I urge you to go find it. I'm not sure if it's available on Netflix or not. I think not. Orlando is adapted from a novel by Virginia Woolf, which takes place across 400 years of history. It's a fantasy. The novel is called Orlando Biography, but it's really Orlando, a fantasy about someone who lives for 400 years.
My favorite part, for those of you as docents of cut or interested in cut, it is like a cavalcade of fashion. And my favorite scene is where her skirts in the 18th century are so wide she can't get through the furniture, and she has to
turn sideways.
It's so good.
So I just have one slide here from Orlando. Orlando starts in the Elizabethan period, and then that's when Orlando is a youth. And you'll notice that Orlando is a youth in the Elizabethan period, but in the 18th century, strangely, Orlando is a woman, which is part of the fantasy. A little bit of a spoiler there, but it's a fabulous film for seeing the way that art history informs the it's a very stylized film, but in fact, all the stylization is coming right out of the stylizations of art history that are the sources for the different periods. So the costume design in this film is just fabulous. And here's a wonderful picture of a couple in front of posing for a portrait in front of a portrait of Orlando's parents on the wall. I'm not actually sure whether this is a real Renaissance portrait in the background or not. The film did use a lot of real locations for its sets, so it possibly is. But you'll notice the way that the cinematic scene is mimicking the painting, and this happens a lot in period films, and it happens very self-consciously in period films sometimes, where famous paintings suddenly appear like a tableau in a scene, which is very exciting for the art historians among us. But of course, imagining what a period moment, what a historical moment looks like, is always being done through the filter of the sort of present sensibilities. So, for example, another story that is typically set in the Elizabethan period, Romeo and Juliet, an adaptation of Shakespeare's play, when seen on film is both the instances that I'm illustrating now. Of course, it's been adapted many times. Probably the three most famous adaptations or well-known adaptations are the 1936 MGM version, which maybe a few of you have seen, with Leslie Howard and Norma Shearer playing Romeo and Juliet, and the 1968 Franco Zeffirelli version with Leonard Whiting and Olivia Hussey playing Romeo and Juliet. That's what you're seeing on the screen right now. There's another more recent version by Baz Luhrmann, but it's updated to the present in the 1990s, so it doesn't have period costume, except for in a costume party scene, sort of a costumey takes on some period costumes. So just to compare these two films for a moment, both of these films are pretty well known to have been interested in authenticity, sort of period authenticity. MGM especially, it was a real prestige production. This was when Irving Thalberg was the head of production at MGM. Norma Shearer was his wife. Every year he would allow one or two films to go way over budget to sort of embellish the MGM prestige, and this was that kind of film. And I have a quote here from, probably from Wikipedia or something. Thalberg's stated intention was, quote, to make the production what Shakespeare would have wanted had he possessed the facilities of cinema. So that's, you know, an ambitious, but also, you know, honorable, I'm sorry, hand hitting my microphone, intention. And in order to establish this kind of authenticity, researchers were sent to Italy to look at art in situ and to look at architecture, to look at the paintings of Botticelli. You can see the influence of some of these paintings, Bellini, Carpaccio, and Gazzoli, they say. And there were academic advisors, university professors hired to come to the set to try to keep things real. Nonetheless, and I have a bunch of different slides and also comparisons to paintings that I'm going to go through in a second. You can really see 1936 and MGM all over this film. There are places where it looks more like an MGM musical of the period. You know, it was shot on big sound stages in Hollywood. In these giant, well-lit rooms that do not match what, you know, the interiors of Palazzi in Verona would have looked like in the 15th or 16th century. And you know, the coiffures and the fashions are adapted to appeal to match the MGM glamour of the day. The Zeffirelli version that was made, it was an English-Italian co-production made on location in Italy, obviously had a greater authenticity of location. And it was shot in color and often with available light. So there was a much more sort of surface realism of setting, and to a certain extent of the material aspects of the world. It wasn't all made for the movies. A lot of it was, you know, real, so to speak. Yeah. And of course, the casting, you have to think about casting as part of the sort of material world of the film too. Norma Shear was in her 30s, and Leslie Howard in his 40s when they were cast as Romeo and Juliet. They were the big, you know, they were the big stars at MGM.
30's the new 20, really. It's fine.
And
it's fine.
They were literally old enough to be the parents of the characters of the age they were supposed to be. Whereas Leonard Whiting and Olivia Hussey were very close to the putative ages of their characters. I think Leonard Whiting was 16 or 17, and Olivia Hussey 14 when they were cast.
With costume design too, a lot of times that sort of faithfulness doesn't apply to the hair and makeup. And I think I call it the Dances with Wolves. But, you know, she had that perm that just didn't feel right.
You're always sort of looking at the past through a lens of contemporary fashion.
So he's got a real sexy 1968 hairdo.
Yes, although the 1968 hairdos do have a certain close, are a little bit closer to the Renaissance.
Okay.
So I have a bunch of pictures up here from. We have a lot to get through.
We do, yeah, we do.
I'm just going to quickly go through some Renaissance paintings to give from both the 15th and 16th century to give you an idea of the kinds of sources. And these are just examples of the kinds of sources.
And that last one with the brocades, it's true that even when you try to be really, really faithful, and I would say in the 30s they would probably get an upholstery fabric to make that dress, it's not made with the same kind of silk and wool blend. It wouldn't move the way fabric would have moved or been made. So you can be as faithful as you want, but today designers still have to use the closest thing they can get. But the characters might have moved differently in it.
Here, this is a drawing for the nurse costume from MGM. And here's Edna May Oliver as the nurse with Leslie Howard and John Barrymore. I'm just sort of pointing out that, you know, they're actually, you know, they're modeling the tights that the men wear and
sometimes the poses. Sometimes the poses from famous paintings are reused.
Basil Rathbone and John Barrymore. And here's the 68 version. Of course, the color seems more painterly, but you can see that the garments are very closely modeled on the kinds of things you might see in a Renaissance painting. That's the source. Here's a black and white still from the film. You can see how both the pose that the photographer is very conscious of Renaissance painting and also still life painting as well as portrait painting. here's Olivia Hussey in one of those brocade-like costumes. What happened to I don't know, the portrait there that disappeared? Oh, well. Another case study, I'll go through this one much more quickly because we are actually short on time. Going ahead a couple centuries, but still in advance of the development of photography. Photography doesn't happen until the 19th century, around 1839. Portrait photography becomes very popular in the 1840s and 50s. So the beginning of the 19th century, there's no photography. What we know about the way people dressed in the time of Jane Austen is from paintings. So here's some very early 19th century paintings. And here is the very sort of wrong MGM image of Pride and Prejudice. They just decided that probably because of the moment, the historical moment, 1940, the fashions have changed in the United States. They're more into the Victorian type than they were the sort of sleek, sexy type that had been in the 30s.
And sometimes when period films become very popular, there'll be multiples of a particular period, then that filters down into what people were into fashion of the day too, which also might...
Right, so this might be part of a vogue in the early 1940s of Victorian representations. The BBC adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, which many of you know, I'm sure, that showed on A&E here in the 1990s, is probably the most faithful in terms of comparing the costumes in the film to paintings. In fact, here's a comparison of an very early 19th century painting of the Jane Austen period and a painting of Colin Firth that appeared in that adaptation.
I love it. So where was that? Just on the wall in the background?
It's a very important scene in the novel that is adapted in that version of the story. Okay. She goes to visit Pemberley and she sees a portrait of him, I know the line because I've written it. This is actually the subject of a chapter of my last book, especially the 2005 adaptation, which I'm coming to in a moment. She fixed his eyes upon herself. She's suddenly very conscious of how she may have been prejudiced, standing in front of a portrait of him in his home while his housekeeper has been telling her such great things about him. So it's a very important moment in the novel, and it's given form with this painting. So they had to make a painting. They didn't do it in the MGM version. That scene is just not there. But they did adapt it fairly faithfully in the BBC version. But in the 2005 version with Keira Knightley, which maybe some of you are familiar with, they changed the setting. It's still Pemberley, but they changed it from her looking at a painting of him to looking at a sculpture. So I'll show you in a moment. I'm very fascinated by the costuming of this. This film has also got a certain amount of realism. In fact, I would call it very realist in its intentions and realist in its visual intentions as well as its more sort of psychological ones. But it translates the story into terms that make sense to a contemporary audience. And Keira Knightley, you can see she's wearing her period clothes the way you might wear blue jeans. Mm-hmm. You know, it's a muslin dress. It's not iron.
That's a really good analogy, actually. Yeah.
And her hair is, stringy, and she's not presenting herself. She's probably not wearing a corset, and she's not presenting herself the way we typically understand someone to be presenting themselves wearing a period costume as a kind of thing to be looked at. She's a very kind of almost tomboyish, very physical, romantic character in this version. But the aesthetics of the film are just a little bit. So it's not this costume company. The costume designer is someone who's doing something more low-key and something that works with the narrative in a different way. This is the house that played Pemberley in the film. It's Chatsworth House, which is the seat of the Dukes of Devonshire. And this is how it appears in this very important scene in the movie where Elizabeth Bennet comes with her aunt and uncle to Pemberley. And this interior scene that is the subject of a chapter of my book was shot in Chatsworth House, starting in this entry hall, which is a stunning space, and moving on to this famous sculpture collection, sculpture gallery. And you'll see that I have just a few still shots from this scene. She moves through the sculpture gallery looking at sculpture in a very, the sculpture is used to sort of turn the problem from the problem of whether she understands Darcy properly to one of kind of sexual desire. They're very sort of erotic sculptures. And notice her costume. It's almost monochromatic, and it matches the colors of the scene. So it turns her into this.
She looks like a fluted column,
Like
which
a
is
fluted
nice.
column, right?
Yeah.
She becomes a figure in the sculpture gallery in this really interesting way. And she's moving through, looking at these very sensual, and the camera work is very sensual. She's moving, navigating the space. And then she comes upon this sculpted bust of him. So it's very different than the painting. And this is a pastiche, of course, because it looks just like Matthew McFadden. It was made to look like a marble sculpture of Darcy. Here she is spying it and looking at it. It really changes the meaning of the scene in the novel. So that's the point of that.
Can I just say they are really good actors? Because if I had to stare at that, I would be laughing.
Really?
I would, because it's still, I mean, I know that's not the worst sculpture I've ever seen, but that's so clearly that
Can I tell you
actor.
something?
Yeah.
It was left on view in the sculpture gallery for many months after the production was there, and after the film came out, people flocked to this to see it as well as the sculptures. When I visited Chatsworth a couple years later, it had been moved to the gift shop, but it was still there. One last slide. This is not Pride and Prejudice. This is a costume that may be in this show.
No, that one's not.
Okay, this is Keira Knightley as the Duchess. Here she is doing the full costume regalia thing, with, playing, in fact, the mother of the 6th Duke of Devonshire, who was the person who collected all that sculpture that was shown in Chatsworth House.
In real life.
She is Georgiana Cavendish is the wife of the 5th Duke of Devonshire, and it's her son that made the facade of Chatsworth look the way it looks, and who collected the art that was seen in that scene. So really interesting tie-in between Keira Knightley and the and Chatsworth House. And now I'm passing.
Oh yeah. So
she, of course, is based on a portrait of Georgiana Cavendish by Thomas Gainsborough.
So those of you who've already heard me give a talk about cut, one of the things that was so interesting, her name is Georgiana in the dialect of her popular sect. She changed her name to Georgiana, so that's what I'll call her. But she was also very involved in, much like an actor might be very involved in their own costume design, with the way Johnny Depp was with Penny Rose. You know, he had real decisions about how he wanted his character to look or move. She did the same thing with her couturier. So she would design a lot of her own clothes and make a lot of fashion-forward moves, including this giant hat, which to this day, so she invented this new look, and it was captured by Gainsborough in a painting. And anyone who saw the painting, all of a sudden, all these women ran to their hat makers and they said, "I want that hat in the picture." And it became known as the picture hat. So to this day, whenever you see a large brimmed hat, they're very often called the picture hats. And it's from the popularity of this picture. So that segues into...
Which I have to just interject to say, I mean, so Georgiana, née Spencer Cavendish, was a celebrity of her day. She was not just a duchess. And Gainsborough made her celebrity, and he painted many portraits of her. Gainsborough and other artists made her celebrity into a kind of and this was the age of the print, so people would have known, like this would have been disseminated through prints, this pre-photography.
So we're going to zoom back to the 20th century. So this was still going on in this idea of wanting what somebody famous is wearing. So in the 20th century, by the time that but classic Hollywood cinema came into its own in the 20s. And then we know the talkies came in at the end of the 20s. And so by the time the 30s hit, it was very well established that this was the new aristocracy. This was who people wanted to emulate. This is what made Max Factor, who also came from Russia, fascinating, is what popularized the acceptability of women wearing makeup. All of these stars wanted to dress like the stars in the films, so the cinema was very astute at capitalizing on that. So as they were making films, they would send designs of these by 1930, a man named Bernard Waldman created the Modern Merchandising Bureau. And so there were these shops, you could only have one per city, and they were called the Cinema Fashions Shop. So this is a cinema fashion shop, And they would sell knockoff, cheaper versions of these famous dresses in the movies. Adrian was one of the most famous between the wars Hollywood designers, and his it's interesting because his work was very much, it looked like high fashion of the time, so it was that blurring of the line. When is the distinction between just popular, everyday dress and costume? And they were taking photo press stills for these films that were really celebrating the gowns, for example. And at the same time, magazines were starting to create photographs that look like movie stills. So it was just blending. So people wanted these dresses. The Adrian dress for Joan Crawford in the movie Letty Linton became known as the Letty Linton dress, and they sold 500,000 copies of that dress in 1932. So these cinema fashion shops, the first one was in New York at Macy's. And I have to tell you that woman sitting on the left is my grandmother. She's wearing a Mae West dress from 1933. So yesterday I tried to figure out which dress, and this is at a department store in Atlanta. I tried to figure out which dress this might be, and I think it might be, because they would be lesser versions. They wouldn't be quite as la-di-da. And if it was silk in the film, it would be rayon. But it might be this one on the left, because it was from the film I'm No Angel. And this is the department store, which when I looked it up, how genius, it's connected, it's right next door to a movie theater. So you go see the movie and you're like, oh God, I have that dress. And then you just go next door.
In the window.
I just think that's fascinating.
Was a model for a fashion.
But she just, it was just wearing these dresses. I mean, so this is where and so there was no division between what fashions people, because there was this weird moment in the 30s of really puffy sleeves again, and that comes from those period films, much like what you were showing, or Renaissance-looking hats, velvet hats, or large brim hats. Oh, yes. Oh, I ruined my own. You didn't see that. So for all the men in the crowd, this was probably the biggest. I mean, I love to believe urban legends, so it may not be true that this was the biggest influence, but that kid standing on his teddy bear kills me. And I do, it's true.
I totally believe it.
I do too.
I've raised children. When a kid sees a movie and there's something in that movie that they can have, they're going to have that.
Right.
That's a little different. Like, the women who wanted the fashion, there were probably more inhibitions on whether that could realistically happen.
I just got done reading Phil Collins' memoir.
Yeah.
And he talked about how Davy Crockett was his biggest hero as a child, and that he eventually became the largest private holder of Alamo mementos.
Oh, wow.
Collection worth over $10 million.
And it probably started with the hat, right?
He talked about how all the boys in England.
Oh, wow. In England. See, that's really interesting.
And they saw.
Right.
And that was the thing all the boys wanted to wear was the Davy Crockett.
That's the power of film right there. That is fascinating.
So I'm going to make short work of the next thing. Another way in which art, cinema, and fashion intersect is in films about artists. One of my favorites of such films is John Huston's Moulin Rouge, which is the Toulouse-Lautrec biopic. I picked this one not only because I love it, but because there's still a little Toulouse-Lautrec show on view upstairs, so you can go from here to there, as well as to the cut exhibition. Here's the title card. You can see that he's using Toulouse-Lautrec's images, his lithographs, lithographic posters underneath the titles. Note in this title card that Schiaparelli did the designs not for all the fashion, not for all the women's period costume, but for the Jane Avril costumes. Zsa Zsa Gabor played Jane Avril.
For those unfamiliar with Schiaparelli, we almost did a whole section on her because her, Salvador Dali, and Mae West could have been the subject of a whole talk. She made surrealist fashions. She made a shoe hat or like a skeleton dress, and she also made a lot of these turn of the century 1900s films.
So here is the source for, on the left in this image is Toulouse-Lautrec, one of Toulouse-Lautrec's many images of Jane Avril, who was a vaudeville, a performer, very popular performer of the day in places like Moulin Rouge, where he frequented. You can see it's based on a cabinet card, a popular photograph. So now we're in the era of photography, where photography and art and fashion are all intersecting. And here is Schiaparelli's costume for Jean-Jacques Devore in the film. The film does all this coloristic. It had a color advisor too, impressionism or imitation of Toulouse-Lautrec's style. So John Huston, for those of you who are not aware of it, was actually also a painter. He was a pretty accomplished painter. So he brought a painter's sensibility to his palette as a director, and he used Schiaparelli and his color consultant to create these very painterly tableaus that really captured the atmosphere of Toulouse-Lautrec's pictures. This is a costume that is not by Schiaparelli, but one that also imitates a very famous...
That's a great example of the pose from popular fine art.
Yeah. And just...
Yeah, go back.
Your last section.
Yeah, we're getting through. So I think, again, just another way to lift off and think about how costumes operate in film, just to take the cut exhibition a little more broadly. This idea that costumes in films very often, and because the earliest chronological costume is from ever after a Cinderella story. So this idea of when is the character put in a Cinderella-like or Pygmalion-like situation, costume plays a huge part in that. And Sabrina is one of these, we've been talking a lot about Edith Head this week, and there's a signed photograph of her in the hallway, you have to see that. But Edith Head designed the costumes for Audrey Hepburn's first film, Roman Holiday, and they were very excited. She was going to be a big star, but it hadn't been released yet, and she was on stage doing a stage version of Gigi at the time. So they wanted to get another great vehicle for her, so they purchased Sabrina, and so Edith Head. Well, anyway, so Audrey Hepburn goes to Paris. They link her up with Hubert de Givenchy, who was very young. He had just opened his own shop. He'd actually been working for Schiaparelli just before this.
For those of you who haven't seen the film, a really important plot line in Sabrina is that Sabrina, who's the daughter of the chauffeur in the household, goes to Paris. So the Paris thing is important for making us sort of believe.
Well, so the other question then is, who plays the role of the fairy godmother? So she's the daughter of the chauffeur working for this family with two very good-looking, handsome sons who are very wealthy, and she lives above the garage. And so every year they would throw this amazing, elaborate society party, and she would hide in the tree and watch it, and she loved David. So Edith had actually only designed the dresses when she was sort of an urchin. She didn't design the really fancy dresses. So then Sabrina, in order to get her away from her love affair for David, her father sends her to cooking school so that she can be a cook like her mother, who was married to the chauffeur. So she goes to cooking school in Paris, and the fairy godmother is this 74-year-old baron who tells her she looks like a horse and cuts her ponytail off and buys her some beautiful dresses. So 2 years later, she comes home looking like this in a Givenchy suit with her poodle, and so then she reconnects with the family and shows up at the party that year wearing that dress. And the thing that's so beautiful about this, again, there's no intersection between Audrey Hepburn, her clothing, Givenchy, the characters she played, because she only wore Givenchy in her everyday life. And she and Givenchy were like brother and sister. He said that she would call him up just to say, "I love you," and hang up. They just adored each other. Somebody said that they both behaved so well at all times. They were just these extraordinary people, and they really got each other. They got each other's look, and he dressed her for 7 films, and she was the face of his perfume in 1957. She never asked for any payment. They were just this seamless group. And on her honeymoon with Mel Ferrar, after Sabrina, she wore the costumes that were by Givenchy and was photographed in Holland in them. So again, there was no distinction between what she wore, who she was, and Givenchy as the costume designer.
Except that in almost every one of those 7 movies, in most of her movies, there is a transformation.
Yes.
So the distinction is between a fictional Audrey Hepburn who is not fashionable. Go to the next.
Oh, yeah. This is Funny Face.
Dowdy intellectual bookstore clerk in Funny Face, directed by Columbia's own Stanley Donen, and what she becomes when she's identified as a prospective model for.
Well, in a sense, there were some parallels maybe in her life, but I think, so in this case, so Funny Face is another incredible example where, first of all, think of some other movies where transformation is a really big part of it. What comes to mind? Where the character suddenly changes her clothes and then changes who she is. Okay. My Fair Lady.
Yes.
Contemporary films. What else?
Pretty Woman.
Okay, good. Pretty Woman, she's all that. And Devil Wears Prada, that's a good example. I kind of think of Funny Face as the precursor to Devil Wears Prada, because instead of, I'm forgetting her name.
Diana Vreeland or Kay Thompson, I don't know what you're talking
Meryl Streep.
about. Meryl Streep.
As Diana Vreeland. Yeah, she's got Kay Thompson at this, but also, so this film is so interesting. It actually was based on the real love life of, so here she is. Okay, she's working in a bookstore. She's an existentialist. Dick Avery, the character played by Fred Astaire, was based on Richard Avedon. Richard Avedon really did fall in love, not with a bookstore clerk, but with a bank clerk, and turned her into a fashion model. So it was based on...
And Avedon actually did a lot of the photography that's used. It did the photography that's used as Dick Avery's photography in the film.
So it's the combination of him seeing her as him actually seeing her and how beautiful she is, and then Kay Thompson as the professional, think pink, we've got to put you in all of these clothes, that ends up, and here, this I just love because it reminds me of Susan because it's this horrendous fake Giacometti sculpture. And then this is the model that they were already using for the magazine. And when she finally does speak, she's told to model with the sculpture. She knows nothing about sculpture. And when she finally speaks, it comes out like a squeak. She's just...
Strong Brooklyn accent, and she's actually reading a Walworth comic book.
Yeah, so she's not the existentialist who works in the bookstore.
That's Aelita, who was actually a very famous model, Vogue model and Desire model of the 1950s, who posed in famous Richard Avedon fashion shoots.
So she goes to Paris. I could have shown you a whole series of photos, but I love this one because, again, it's that reflection of art as she comes down the staircase at the Louvre. And... I mean, we could go on and on with her, with other films, but I think My Fair Lady, which is clearly a Pygmalion myth, is that our last slide? That's it.
That's our last.
Yeah, so it is, we're over. But that idea of costume changing the person, and I will say too, Audrey Hepburn said that she never had faith in her own acting ability. She thought of Givenchy as her psychiatrist and sort of acting coach, because as soon as she put on those clothes, she felt different. And that's what all actors say about these costumes, and especially with period costumes, because you've moved differently as well.
And we're back at the big picture hat.
Yeah, the big picture hat. Yes, thank you, Noelle.
Indeed we are.
So now that we've talked your ear off, do you have any questions?
We left a little time.
I know.
Or just remarks.
Yeah.
Well, Sabrina, I always wanted to know what color the Barbie was on that dress.
What color it was?
And
Black.
When I bought the Barbie doll so I could have it.
Good for you.
I knew what the dress looked like. I always wondered.
Yeah, it was black embroidery. Good for you for buying the Barbie doll. That's interesting because back in hundreds of years ago, that's how they would send fashions around, was on a Barbie-sized doll, and that's how seamstresses, you knew, I want that dress, and you would construct it from that. So that's interesting. Yeah. Yes. Questions also about the exhibition. That'd be great.
Jane, what two of the costumes are in front of a large photograph? Is that actually Chatsworth?
It's not Chatsworth, and I feel so bad. I want to say it's like Kendallston Hall. Do you remember
Definitely
that?
not Chatsworth.
But
it wouldn't have been because Chatsworth didn't look the way it looks now at the time she lived there. The characteristic facade was built by her son.
The scrims that came with the exhibition, they're really just in no case, that's the one that's closest to the real thing, and it's because there was an interior scene filmed in that. I think it's Kendallston Hall.
I looked at the filming locations for the Duchess. They did use Chatsworth, but they used more other locations, I think.
And that would have been one of them, yeah. Yes.
Who actually puts up the costumes? I mean, do the museum personnel or do people who travel with the costumes?
So that's a really good question. So I devised where they would go and what the layout and what the story they wanted to tell, and worked with our exhibition designer Mike Dwyer on the colors but when it comes to the costumes themselves, so Cosprop is a London firm that makes these costumes, and then there's an exhibition group that is in charge of organizing the tour. But a friend of John Bright's, who used to be a costume designer, now she's full-time follows with these exhibitions. She's the one that has to, they come dressed in a crate, so we would bring the mannequins out and all of us would, help place them.
They're already on the mannequin?
They're on the mannequins, but not their jewelry, hats, shawls, details. So we would all place them.
And there were 3 different costumes.
We would all place them where they were going, and then Nancy Lawson, who chose, she went to Cosprop and chose which costumes would come. She then steamed them, sewed the jewels on, did the fluffing and
Something that I find
yeah.
fascinating about being in the presence of these
Yes, please.
costumes and these mannequins. Because these costumes were made for actual actors, those mannequins actually have to have the bodies of those actual actors.
Well, and she said that there's only one size for the male mannequins. So those, it's not the same with the females, but the males are not as representative, and yet somehow all the costumes fit. So it's kind of strange.
Men's clothing is really different.
But some of them, Randy Quaid is a lot taller than some.
That's
yeah.
true. And I'm not saying that they cast these from, Scarlett Johansson's own body,
Yeah.
but it's really it's a little uncanny to be in the presence of these sort of, I guess you could say, simulacra of the stars for whom these costumes were fitted, because these are, although I learned in the show that some of them have to have multiples because of the way that they're used in the production, they're pretty high-end, highly artisanally produced things, and they're not manipulable the way stuff off the rack is.
Yes, Emily.
Something that you said yesterday that I thought was very interesting is the Duchess's relationship to our Diana Spencer.
Yeah, I almost mentioned that earlier. She is related. Now I'm going to forget the number, but they're from the Spencer family, and it really made me go back and think about Lady Diana and what a fashion icon she was, and how that made her so beloved, and what that can do. And then once she was so beloved, she did something very much like Georgiana did, where she took that into all this international good works, and she just became more beloved. So clothing can operate on a
Which is also true of Audrey Hepburn.
Yeah, absolutely. But a person in the public eye, how can clothing operate? And how, it's kind of a mind-blowing thing that we just get dressed in the morning, but we could change the world, really.
You can.
Yeah. Any other exhibition questions, or? I want to say thank you for coming out at lunchtime on a weekday. Thank you.